Exodus chapter 1. Father, thank you for your word and for preserving it all of these centuries, Lord. All the different authors, yet it all just fits together perfectly. And so, Father, we thank you for the opportunity to study your word and to learn of your plan for our salvation today. And so thank you. Thank you that we get to study your word, and please open our hearts and minds to it, that it could take root and change us, Lord. Thank you, Father. Amen. So, we're back in the Old Testament. Well, what I try to do is I do an Old Testament book because they're so long, and then we do a couple of New Testament. So we did Hebrews and James, and now we're back into Exodus. So we were in Genesis last time when we were in the Old Testament. And we saw back in Genesis chapter 15 when God was making a covenant with Abraham. He says, and he was Abram still back then, his name hadn't been changed. I'm in Genesis 15:13. Then he said to Abram, "Know certainly that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs." And he was talking about Egypt. "And will serve them, and they will afflict them 400 years. And also the nation whom they serve I will judge. Afterward they shall come out with great possessions. Now as for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried at a good old age, but in the fourth generation they shall return here, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet." Last Wednesday we talked about eschatology, and this verse, as I was studying it, went bing in my brain, because you know the parable of the fig tree? When Israel comes back together in 1948, and this generation shall not pass till all these things happen? Well, how long is a generation according to Genesis 15? You don't have it in front of you, so I'll read it to you again. They're going to be afflicted for 400 years. And then he says, but in the fourth generation, they're going to come back. So according to this verse, it's 100 years. So that's why Jesus did not come back, even though there were 88 reasons why Jesus will return in 1988. I see some smiles because you remember that book. 1948, Israel became a nation, and they thought 40 years was a generation, so it'd be 1988. Must be 2048 maybe. Anyhow, I'm off track. Let's get back to our section here. The Amorites. Who were the Amorites? Well, they were Canaanites, and they're representing the Canaanites. And remember, Ham, Shem, and Japheth, Noah's sons. Ham's son, Canaan, Noah pronounced a curse on Canaan. He says, you guys are going to serve your brothers. He said, "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants he shall be to his brethren." And so in Genesis chapter 15, God is telling Abraham, your kids can't take possession of the promised land yet, because the iniquity of those Canaanites that are living here isn't full. They're going to get worse. They're going to do child sacrifice. They're going to do really evil things. And then it's appropriate for me to come and judge them. And it'll be righteous judgment. But Abraham, your kids are going to be in another land for 400 years, and I'm going to build you into a nation. So we left off in the book of Genesis. Jacob, or Israel, remember his name was changed to Israel, had taken his entire family to Egypt because of a worldwide famine. Then in Egypt, he found his lost son, Joseph, who happened to be Pharaoh's governor. And Pharaoh gave him the best of the land in Goshen to dwell in. And then Jacob dies in Egypt, and Joseph and his brothers carry him back to the promised land to bury him, but then they go back down to Egypt because the famine is still going on. They thought they were going to be there temporarily. It turns out to be 400 years. And we pick up the narrative here in Exodus chapter 1. It's been about 300 years since Jacob came down and discovered Joseph. Now, Exodus is divided into two major sections. 1 through 18 deal with the deliverance out of Egypt. And chapters 19 through 40 deal with Israel walking in relationship with God. Chapter 19, we start with Israel at the base of Mount Sinai, and God presents himself. And so the book is two sections. Right now we're in the let's get the Israelites out of Egypt section. So chapter 1, verse 1. Now these are the names of the children of Israel who came to Egypt. Each man in his household came with Jacob: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. All those who were descendants of Jacob were 70 persons, for Joseph was already in Egypt. And so in these verses, we have a link from Genesis to Exodus. And we're going from the patriarch family, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now they're a nation. It's not a patriarch. Now we have a leader, but it's a theocracy. It's going to be. In Genesis 46:27, it says that 70 people left the promised land for Egypt. And here in Exodus 1:5, it says the same thing, 70 people. But remember Stephen, the first martyr? He was stoned. In Acts chapter 7, verse 14, he says it was 75. So some people might say, oh, there's a discrepancy. But Stephen is including all of Joseph and his family. So if you get hit with that question, that's why. It's really the same number of people. If you think of it, there were 75 Israelites to start this nation. How many do you think it could grow to in about 300 years, 400 years? 75 people. And that's just the males, by the way. Verse 6, and Joseph died, all his brothers, and all that generation. But the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly, multiplied, and grew exceedingly mighty, and the land was filled with them. In that one verse, there's a point he's trying to make. What do you think it is? Fruitful, increased, abundantly, multiplied, grew exceedingly mighty, filled. There's a population explosion. In Exodus chapter 12:37, it reads, the children of Israel journeyed from Ramses to Succoth, about 600,000 men on foot, besides children. So we went from 75 to 600,000 at least in the 300 years. If you add all the wives, how many are we talking about? It's over 1 million. Some people think it might even have been up to 2 million people. Pretty cool. Verse 8, now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. Now, if Joseph was managing the drought and all that food, and he was second only to Pharaoh, wouldn't you think any new king would remember him? By not knowing Joseph, it means he had no appreciation for Joseph's accomplishments or character. Now, I'm going to do the history class here a little bit, so if your eyes glaze over, you have permission for glazed eyes, okay? The Hyksos dynasty was ruling when Joseph was in Egypt. Interestingly, these were descendants of Shem. These were not Egyptians. That's why when we read the story, the jailkeeper, it says he was Egyptian. Why would it say that? If he's living in Egypt and it's ruled by Egypt, of course he'd be Egyptian. But no, this was ruled by descendants of Shem. And so they were Semites, you could say. And they ruled Egypt from 1674 to 1535. And they had 5 different rulers. Now in 1550 to 1077, there was a new kingdom in Egypt. And these were Egyptians. And they wiped out the previous dynasty. And the new kingdom was from the 18th to the 20th dynasties. That means you have a family that's ruling, and then they get wiped out or they die out, and a new dynasty, a new family will take over and rule. And they hated the Hyksos dynasty and overthrew them. Get these guys out of here. Get these Semites out of here. And, the Israelites, well, they're of Shem also. So we kind of maybe don't like them. Now, Moses was born around the beginning of this new kingdom, under one of the first 3 pharaohs in the 18th dynasty. In the 18th dynasty, there were 15 different pharaohs. And we had the dynasty before, when Joseph came. Now, when Moses led Israel out of Egypt, he was likely dealing with a woman named Hatshepsut. Hatshepsut. And she was the 5th pharaoh in the 18th dynasty. And then her nephew, Thutmose III, who became Pharaoh at age 2. You can see why she had to rule for a while. They co-ruled. But he became Pharaoh at age 2. When he became an adult, he started his reign in 1479 to 1425. And then we have Amenhotep II. Hey, I did that one okay, didn't I? It sounded real. I don't know if it's right, but it sounded real. And he was the 7th in the 18th dynasty. And he was from 1425 to 1400. Now, to put this all in your brain, Moses led Israel into the promised land, or really Joshua did, around 1400, just generally. So from Joseph to Moses, leading Israel out of Egypt, we may have had as many as 40 different pharaohs. No wonder why the guy doesn't remember who Joseph was. Verse 9, and so this new guy, this new Pharaoh, he said to his people, look, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And it happen, in the event of war, that they also join our enemies and fight against us, and so go up out of the land. So we have several fears listed here by the ruling class. First one is Israel was more in number and mightier than the Egyptians, and they were still multiplying. Now, Egypt was known for their their self-view of racial superiority. Remember when Israel came down, they said, oh, they're shepherds. We don't like shepherds. Put them out there in Goshen. Let them tend the sheep. But now these visitors are growing stronger, and they're outnumbering the locals. And so the second thing, lest they join our enemies and fight against us. So they might rebel. They're getting to be more than us, and they might rebel and take over. And then last, and so go up out of the land. We're going to lose our cheap labor. This is a real political problem. And so we have the solution beginning in verse 11. Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with their burdens. And they built for Pharaoh supply cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew. And they were in dread of the children of Israel. So the Egyptians made the children of Israel serve with rigor. And they made their lives bitter with hard bondage, in mortar, in brick, and in all manner of service in the field. All their service in which they made them serve was with rigor. So they start off by afflicting them. Hard labor. And part of this labor was to build 2 key cities. Both of them were store cities, meaning they're storehouses of treasure and food. Pithom, also called Hierapolis, we don't really know where it is, but it's likely around 60 miles. One view is at 60 miles southwest of Cairo. Hey, can we put that slide up, you guys? Ramses, they think they've discovered it. So here's Ramses. One view is that Pithom is down here. There are some other views that it's up in this region. So here's Ramses, the city they built. This is the land of Goshen where they're living. Okay, we'll just leave that up for a bit. Ramses became the capital of Egypt eventually. And in the ruins they've discovered, they're assuming that there's about 300,000 people that live there. I like verse 12. The more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew. It's like, give me some Roundup, I'll spray that weed. And I spray it, and they put Miracle Grow in there instead. It just shows God has a sense of humor. God just blessed them. He has Israel down there for a purpose, to grow them into a nation. And the Egyptians aren't going to thwart that purpose. And the result is that they dreaded them. We're trying to crush them, and they're still growing. What are we going to do? It's out of our control. Then the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, of whom the name of one was Shipporah, and the name of the other Puah. So what he's been doing isn't working. He's trying to, we'll just make them work hard and crush them, and they're multiplying. Oh no, I better come up with a second plan. And these 2 names, if you have 600,000 men, means you probably have 600,000 women. How many of them are having babies? 2 midwives aren't going to do it. So these must have been the head of the midwife association or something, the leaders of the midwives. And he said, when you do the duties of a midwife for the Hebrew women and see them on their birth stools, take note of this, mothers. I picked a great passage for Mother's Day, didn't I? Apparently they had their babies by setting 2 stones and sitting on the stones and delivering the baby. Alternative birth center, I guess. When you see them on the birth stools, if it is a son, then you shall kill him. But if it is a daughter, then she shall live. How cruel. You just think if this had succeeded, the nation of Israel would have disappeared, because the nation, in that culture, the men were what carried on the name. So they could be wiped out in one generation. So up to this point, we see 2 arms of Pharaoh's oppression against Israel: slave labor and child extermination. Pretty brutal. Verse 17, but the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the male children alive. What I like about this is they must have feared Pharaoh, but apparently they feared God more. The civil government was commanding something that was evil and clearly against God, and the midwives chose to obey God instead of man. So in verse 18, so the king of Egypt called for the midwives and said to them, why have you done this thing and saved the male children alive? Uh-oh, they're being called on the carpet, they're in trouble. And the midwife said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are lively and give birth before the midwives come to them. Okay, so they're either lying, right? Or they might have been telling the truth. Maybe God was indeed blessing them and, call for the midwife. Whoop, whoop, the baby's here. Who knows? They were always too late. Or maybe the midwives were, the baby's coming, and they just put on their slow mode and walked real slow. We don't know what happened. But in any case, there was that opportunity when they were supposed to take the life of the child, and it was when the mother gave birth. I guess he's saying, you can kind of pretend there was a stillbirth or something, but that opportunity was gone. So what are the midwives supposed to do when the baby's laying over there, all wrapped up and has arrived? But we see here that Pharaoh doesn't punish them, but God deals with them. Verse 20, therefore God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very mightily. And so it was, because the midwives feared God, that he provided households for them. Why did God bless them? It's in that sentence I just read. It wasn't because they lied to Pharaoh. It was because they feared God. They feared God, and God blessed them for that. Gave them houses. Verse 22, so Pharaoh commanded all his people, saying, let's go to plan number C. Every son who is born you shall cast into the river, and every daughter you shall save alive. How long is the time period when they can kill the child now? It's not just at the birth moment. It could be months or years even. If you find a male child, you didn't throw him in the river like I commanded you. The people could be in trouble. He's determined to get rid of these boys. What do you think happened as the oppression increased and increased and increased? What do you think happened in the hearts of the Israelites? What happens normally when we see a people that are under oppression? It's when they turn to the Lord and cry out to the Lord. And that was happening here. The people are crying out to the Lord as they suffer more and more. God, don't you see what's going on? Please save us. And so chapter 2 begins the next topic, which is God's Savior for the Israelites. And a man of the house of Levi went and took as wife a daughter of Levi. So the woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw that he was a beautiful child, she hid him 3 months. But when she could no longer hide him, she took an ark of bulrushes, which is a type of cattail, an ark of bulrushes for him, daubed it with asphalt and pitch, put the child in it, and laid it in the reeds by the river's bank. And his sister stood afar off to know what would be done to him. Now, chapter 2, verse 1 is about 1526 BC, at the beginning of the reign of Thutmose I. And we're not told Moses' parents until Exodus, their parents' name, until Exodus chapter 6, verse 20. And they were Amram and Jochebed. They had two other children before Moses. Aaron was about 3 years older, and then his older sister Miriam. Now, you guys have all seen Charlton Heston and the Exodus and the whole deal, and she puts the ark in the river, and it floats down the river and happens to flow in by where the princess is, right? What I'm reading here says they put it in the weeds. It's like, let's hide him for a while. And the daughters, they're watching. Hiding him in the reeds, I mean, what else are you going to do? What's interesting is, technically, she's complying with Pharaoh's order. Toss him in the river. Well, I did, but he happened to be in a boat. Good thinking, Mom. Moms are so wise. So this isn't a picture of a basket floating down the river. This is a picture of a desperate mother hiding the child among the reeds with faith in God to do something. Somehow save this child. Verse 5. Then the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river. And her maidens walked along the riverside, and when she saw the ark among the reeds, she sent her maid to get it. And when she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby wept. I'm hungry, feed me. Oh, that's not in there. So she had compassion on him and said, this is one of the Hebrew children. Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and call a nurse for you from the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for you? I might just know someone. Isn't this neat how God works? And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, go. So the maiden went and called the child's mother. Then Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages. So God is reconciling Moses back with his mom. And not only that, mom's getting paid to take care of him. See how God just blesses and blesses? They can't get away from his blessings. And the child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. So she called his name Moses, saying, because I drew him out of the water. Now, obviously, this whole event was orchestrated by God. He returned the child to his mother, caused him to receive wages, and then puts him in a situation where he's going to be educated. He's preparing him to deliver the Israelites out of the country. It says she called his name Moses, saying, because I drew him out of the water. There's a little confusion on Moses, the name. They're not sure if it was a Hebrew word or an Egyptian word. Now, interesting, the Egyptian word Moshe, M-O-S-E-H, meaning a son. And it could have been a pun on the Hebrew word Masha, which means to draw out. So maybe she's putting a couple words together to come up with his name, but she named him. Notice that mom didn't get to name him. The Egyptian princess named him. Verse 11. Now it came to pass in those days when Moses was grown. We've jumped 40 years now. He's been raised by the princess. He's been adopted by the Egyptians. He's raised in the palace. Came to pass in those days when Moses was grown that he went out to his brethren and looked at their burdens. And he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his brethren. So he looked this way and that way, and when he saw no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. And when he went out the second day, behold, 2 Hebrew men were fighting. And he said to the one who did the wrong, why are you striking your companion? Would have been about 1485 BC. In the reign of that female pharaoh, the name that I couldn't say, Hatshepsut, the ant. In verse 12, he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew. Now, Acts chapter 7, verses 24 through 25, provides us with commentary on this event. And of course, the New Testament is the best commentary on the Old Testament. It reads, and seeing one of them suffer wrong, he defended and avenged him who was oppressed, and struck down the Egyptian. For he supposed that his brethren would have understood that God would deliver them by his hand. But they didn't understand. So apparently at that time, according to Stephen, who said that, Moses knew that he was a Hebrew. He rejected the oppression of the Hebrews, and he thought they would understand that he was to be their Savior. So he looks around, nobody's watching, except for the Hebrews. Kills the guy, buries him in his hands. See, I defended you. And so when he comes back the next day and sees the two Hebrews fighting, and he goes, you guys, what are you doing? You're brothers. You shouldn't be fighting. Verse 14, then he said, who made you a prince and judge over us? Do you intend to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? And Moses went, oh, it's public knowledge. I killed the Egyptian. Look, the Hebrews are talking. Everybody's going to find out. Oh no, I thought they'd understand. I'm here to help them. And so Moses feared and said, surely this thing is known. Verse 15, when Pharaoh heard of this matter, he sought to kill Moses. But Moses fled from the face of Pharaoh and dwelt in the land of Midian. And he sat down by a well. Here's Midian over here. Okay? So Moses is here. He would have traveled this kind of a route. It's a trade route, well-known ancient trade route, down to Midian. Here's where the real Mount Sinai is believed to be. This is 100 miles, that line. So what is that, 100, maybe 200? It's long walk. So that's where he fled to. The land of Midian in northwestern Saudi Arabia. Well, what's the deal with Midian? After Sarah died, Abraham took another wife, Keturah. Midian was the fourth son of Keturah. She had 6 sons. Midian was number 4. In Genesis 15, we see Abraham sending Keturah and her children and all the other family away so that they don't compete with Isaac. And he sent them, it says, to the land of the east. So let's see, would that be east? He's living up here, he sent him east. Apparently, he migrated down here. Verse 16. Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters. We have a priest of Midian? Would these guys have known who the real God is? Well, yeah. They're not descendants of Isaac, but they remember great-great-great-grandpa Abraham. They'd remember that he's in relationship with God. They would have heard about the promises that God had made. So apparently, this guy who's a priest of Midian and had 7 daughters, he knew the Lord. And they came to and drew water, and they filled the troughs to water their father's flock. Cool. Then the shepherds came and drove them away. So they filled the water, the girls filled the troughs, and the guys come and drive them away and bring their own sheep in. But Moses, he wore the white cowboy hat. He was the good guy. Stood up and helped them and watered their flock. When they came to Reuel, their father, so this would be the priest of Midian, Reuel, also known as Jethro later on in the Bible, he said, how is it that you have come so soon today? How'd you water the animals so quickly? And they said, an Egyptian delivered us from the hand of the shepherds. And he also drew enough water for us and watered the flock. Why do they think he's Egyptian? I wonder what he was wearing, his clothes. Probably Egyptian clothes, if he was raised in the Egyptian palace. He helped us. He watered the flock, and he drove the guys away. Yeah, well, where is he? Why is it that you have left the man? Call him that he may come and eat bread. Were the daughters kind of dumb, or was maybe Moses was really quite a gentleman? I helped you, but I'm not going to force myself upon you. Then Moses was content to live with the man, and he gave Zipporah his daughter to Moses. Boy, interesting, in just one verse, how many years do you think went by? So Moses gets married to Zipporah, and she bore him a son and called his name Gershom, for he said, I have been a stranger in a foreign land. Now Zipporah means little bird, pretty name. Gershom means expulsion or resident. Resident alien. What a great name. Name your kid. I'm going to name you Expulsion. Well, you interpret it, I'm in banishment. You're my child of my banishment, is really what the name meant. wasn't a slide on the child, it was describing Moses' circumstances. Verse 23, now it happened in the process of time that the king of Egypt died. And this was probably Tutmos III. Then the children of Israel groaned because of the bondage, and they cried out, and their cry came up to God because of the bondage. So God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. And God looked upon the children of Israel, and God acknowledged them. So Moses fled at about the age of 40. And he's in exile for 40 years, making him 80 years old when he begins his ministry. I'm not there yet. I can't start yet. I've got 20 more years almost. Isn't that interesting? In the next chapters, when he begins his ministry, he's going to go back to Egypt, different pharaohs there, and we're going to pick that up at chapter 3 next time.